Very often in studying the New Testament, the name Josephus comes up, either in reference works or in lectures, and it is quite common to ask, who is Josephus? Joseph ben Matthias, as his given name was called, was born around 37 or 38 AD. He was a Jew who lived in Palestine, and he was raised in Jerusalem. He spent his young years, like a lot of people in the ancient world, trying to climb the social ladder. And by the year 66 AD, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem appointed him to be the man in charge of the defense of Galilee, because that's when the Roman war had started, 66 AD. He was given the defense of Galilee. He went up to Galilee to look around in the situation there. And most scholars believe that Josephus was using this as kind of an opportunity for himself. Many of the Jews of the upper class believed that the Romans were going to win this war. And when the war was all over, the Romans were going to use local people and appoint them as leaders over cities and other things to keep the country pacified. And so most scholars believe that Josephus was probably looking for that kind of opportunity himself, that even though he had been put in charge of the defense of Galilee and resisting the Romans, that ultimately Josephus may have thought he was going to get something out of this himself personally. However, everything changes in the year 66 when Josephus is captured by the Romans as he is leading the defense of a little place called Jotapata up in Galilee. He is taken captive by the Romans, and he normally would have been executed as a leader of the resistance. But Josephus predicted that Vespasian, who was the Roman general in charge of the war in Judea, would become emperor one day. Vespasian believed that Josephus was a prophet, and so he spared Josephus' life and kept him with the Romans until the war was over. So from this point onward, Josephus is with the Romans, and he has a front row seat to watch the Jewish war. And he travels with the Romans as they make their way down the country, and he witnesses the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the city and the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD. And so he is an eyewitness of one of the most important events in New Testament studies, the destruction of Jerusalem. Josephus left 4 literary works behind him. The first one is called simply The Jewish War, and it is his account, his eyewitness account, of the events surrounding the war and his description of what he saw in the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it is our best source of information for that event. A second work is called The Antiquities of the Jews. It is a much longer work, and it is a book basically on Jewish history. Other Jews had written books about Jewish history, but The Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus is the only complete surviving account of Jewish history from ancient times. And so it is a very valuable resource from that perspective as well. And his history of the Jews does not stop at the end of the biblical history. He continues on through the history of the Herods and into the Roman procurators. And so it is a very valuable look at the very slice of time that we are interested in as we study the New Testament. A third book by Josephus is simply sometimes called The Life, or The Life of Josephus. It's called the Vita in its Latin title, and it is Josephus' autobiography. It is, in fact, the only surviving autobiography that we know of before Christians started writing autobiographies. His autobiography was written to defend his conduct during the Jewish war. Obviously, here we have a Jewish leader who winds up on the side of the Romans, and so that is a very questionable thing in itself. And so Josephus wrote this book to defend his actions and to explain to his fellow countrymen just exactly how it is that he wound up on the side of the Romans. He's defending himself against charges of being a traitor, obviously. And then a fourth literary work that Josephus produced is called Against Apion. Apion was an Egyptian scholar who had published some very harsh criticisms of the Jewish people and said some very nasty things about them. And so Josephus took up in this book to refute the claims of this Egyptian scholar. But Apion was not the only person in antiquity who made outlandish and degrading claims about the Jews. And so in this book, even though Apion figures prominently as the object of the rebuttal, there are other people and other misinformations about the Jews that are addressed. And in particular, it defends the antiquity of the Jewish people. And so therefore, it is kind of an appendix to his story in the Jewish antiquities itself. So if you think about the context in which Josephus lived and wrote, he is of tremendous value for those of us who do New Testament studies. First of all, he is a tremendous source of information when it comes to the political situation in Judea in the first century. He lived through that situation, he participated in it, and he knew all of the players and their backgrounds. And so it is a tremendously close look from a contemporary source of what it was like to be in Palestine in the first century AD from a Jewish point of view. Secondly, the political conditions in the land, the tensions that were in the land, the factors that led up to the war are a fascinating read. Like all political analysis, we may sometimes wonder if Josephus got it exactly right, but just to listen to somebody from ancient times talk about that and talk about what they thought was going on is a valuable resource in itself. And then, of course, there's the biblical aspect. Josephus writes a history of the Jewish people in his Jewish Antiquities. And it's always interesting to know what the Jews thought their Bible said. And in this case, it's rather interesting because Josephus is not a rabbi. He's not speaking for official Judaism, even though he is a Pharisee. But his is a perspective that we might not get anyplace else. And so he preserves understandings and traditions of the Jews and it helps us to understand how the Jews interpreted their own Bible and their own times. In addition to all of that, Josephus mentions major characters that are mentioned in the Bible. He mentions John the Baptist. He has a brief mention of Jesus, although that mention was probably tampered with by later Christian scribes. There is something there that he said about Jesus. He mentions Pontius Pilate. He mentions Herod. He mentions Herod Antipas. He mentions Festus. He mentions Felix. All of these characters that we know of from the New Testament are there in Josephus as well. And the value of the account in Josephus is that it is contemporary with the New Testament events. And so we have here an author who is describing these people and their histories from the standpoint of that time. He's not writing 200 or 300 years later from hearsay, but he's writing as one who lived through that period in time. There's perhaps one other thing that it might be useful to know about Josephus, and that is he does have something of an agenda as he is writing. When Josephus starts writing his literary works after the First Jewish War, the Jewish people are a people with sort of a black eye socially. They are a defeated people. They've suffered this horrible, embarrassing defeat at the hands of the Romans. And even before that, the Jews were kind of a rejected and scorned people. They just didn't fit in with Hellenistic culture very well. And so one of the things that runs throughout Josephus's narratives and his writings is that he is trying to kind of rehabilitate the image of the Jewish people in antiquity. And so as he tells their story, he tells the story from a point of view that an outside reader would find to be admirable. He tells the stories in the way that perhaps somebody from Greek culture would best understand those stories. And he paints this picture of the Jewish people as a very ancient and noble people who, in his opinion, are worthy of the respect of others. He tries to explain the origin of the Jewish war by saying that it was a bunch of young troublemakers who were bent on the war. It wasn't all the Jewish people all over the world who wanted this war. And so there's this very kind of apologetic strain in his writings as well. Sometimes some scholars think that that may interfere with his telling of the story, but it's hardly to be imagined that he could write otherwise. So Josephus is a valuable resource for anybody that wants to study the New Testament and to understand those times better.